everybody, and have a nice morning, evening, or afternoon, or whatever where you are on the globe. So this is a well-timed webinar because we are at the eve of the Internet Governance Forum in Baku, and the question of principles for Internet governance will be certainly one of the key issues which will be discussed in the forthcoming week in Azerbaijan, in Baku. And what I will to do in this with this lecture is to give you a more historical background so that you can understand a little bit better what will be the subject of the discussion in Baku and how we can move forward toward what I call a universal Internet governance framework of principles, as called FOP. And this is part of a discussion we had already in various other places, and it contributes to a better understanding of the role of principles in Internet governance. So next slide, please. Can you, Arvin, can you give us the next slide? Or can I do it myself here? Probably, yes. Okay, so to understand all this discussion on principles better, it makes sense to go back into the history and to see the whole development of the Internet. As many people know and will remember, the Internet was the result of a military research which started in the 1950s already, when the Soviets launched their first Sputnik, their first satellite, and the US was looking for response to this challenge. And one idea was to have a decentralized communication network which would not allow the enemy, at this time the Soviet Union, to destroy the center of communication with one hit. So the idea was to have such a decentralized network which cannot be destroyed by a military attack, a nuclear attack from the other side. So some people argued we have to have more nodes than the Russians have rockets, so they would be unable to destroy the whole communication network, because in a war, as everybody knows, communication is a central issue. So, and the result of this first wave of the Internet was in 1969 the emergence of the ARPANET, the Advanced Research Project Agency Network, which finally became more or less the forerunner of the Internet. But in the second wave, then in the 1970s and 80s until the 1990s, then this new idea to have a decentralized network was taken up by the academic community, because it was mainly graduate students who developed this idea of a decentralized network. And after some tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States has been watered down in the 1970s, the military aspect did not disappear, but was not at the forefront anymore. And the academics discovered this as a wonderful tool to enhance their academic communication. And so a key element was certainly the connection of various different networks, so that computers within network could not only communicate to each other, but could communicate also to computers in other networks. And the breakthrough here was the invention of the TCP/IP protocol, which was done by Bob Kahn and Vint, and that's why the two guys are labeled even today as the fathers of the Internet. So, and the next wave of the Internet came with the invention of the World Wide Web. This was more or less then the commercial phase, which is still dominant today with the .com boom and then the collapse of the .com bubble. And I think this commercial dimension really enriched the whole policy debate on Internet, and made also clear, more than before, that it's not enough to have just technical rules, codes and protocols and standards, but we need also some other more general principles, political principles, or let's say in this time principles which would guarantee a fair competition in this new field. In the year 2000, when the number of Internet users crossed first the 300 billion, then the 500 billion line, and later a million line, and later it was 1 billion, the Internet really became a thing for nearly everybody. And here the World Summit on the Information Society was certainly, you know, the main event which channeled all the discussions and produced a number of frameworks, including the Internet Governance Forum, which we have today on the agenda. And I think today we are already one step further, because now the internet is for everybody and everything, you know, with all these new devices, mobile devices, with cloud computing, the Internet of Things. So the internet, in our traditional understanding, has reached, meanwhile, the daily life and is used for everything by everybody. We have now around 5 billion people who are using a mobile phone. We have nearly 3 billion people who have direct access to the internet, and I think the next generation of mobile phones have incorporated access to the internet. So that means you can expect in the years ahead that 5 or even 6 billion people will use the internet. So as I let me go to the next slide. As I mentioned already, the military phase, there is no need to go further down here. It was, and it should not be forgotten, that the whole research was financed by the US government via the Department of Defense. This plays still a certain role today when we speak about US economy of the internet, that one of the reasons why this has evolved is that all the research, all the first steps on the internet was done by the United States of America. And when we had the first meeting with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, as from the Working Group on Internet Governance, Kofi Annan used the argument, you cannot wish away history. And that's why, you know, we have to understand also the history. But more important is then what happened in the next step in the 70s and 80s. And here's a very interesting process, that the internet was not pushed forward by governmental regulation or governmental programs. It's true that the government paid for it, in particular the US government, but all the principles, norms, frameworks, and policies were developed in a new way, in a bottom-up self-regulatory process where the concerned and affected parties themselves developed the norms and principles and rules and all the regulations, which were called already since 1969 RFCs. This was a new idea. RFC stands for Request for Comment. Steve Crocker, you know, also a graduate student who shared a class already from the high school with Vint, Cerf, you know, had this idea to say, okay, here we have a problem, we need a solution, we need a certain regulation. I have an idea, but probably it's not the best idea. Let's ask others for a comment. And so he published a request for comment. The acronym was RFC. And then when people answered and commented on the original proposal, and the agreement reached a certain level, which was called rough consensus, then this was adopted and got a number, like a law in the parliament, which has a certain majority and then, you know, gets a certain number or a code. So, and this is a new way of lawmaking, the RFC procedure, and all the other things we know, you know, starts from the ED to the TCP/IP to the mobile codes and the domain name system. All this was developed via this new procedure, and this was done in the shadow of governmental regulation. I think this is also an important point, that governments really did not interfere into this process of self-regulation. So all the regulatory frameworks was done by the users and the providers of the services themselves. And, you know, there came two other elements which are also, you know, a little bit different from our traditional world. One is the architecture of the whole network. So the architecture is really a network architecture. Normally, all institutions we have in our world are hierarchical organized. You know, you have on top, you have a leader, and then you have a committee, you know, around the top person, and then it goes down with a lot of other branches. You take the Catholic Church, you have the Pope, and then the cardinals, and then the archbishops, and then the bishop. So it's a hierarchy. And if you go to trade unions, to parties, to the government itself, everything is organized in a hierarchy. But the internet is organized in a network, which is totally different. And the problem here is that this architecture based on the norms and principles is an open network. So that means if you use a protocol, you can add other applications, other services just using the protocol, and then you are connected. And another important point is there is no central authority in the network. So that means all the intelligence, all the decision-making power, if you wish to say so, is on the edges, not in the center. I think hierarchical organizations have the decision-making power on the top or in the center of an organization. But the Internet does not have such a center, does not have such a central authority. It's the end-to-end principle which makes the Internet so strong. With other words, if you have 3 billion Internet users, you have 3 billion decision makers, because everybody can participate in the process of making norms. This is what some people have called innovation without permission. That means if you want to add something, if you want to link a service to the Internet, there is no authority where you have to ask whether this is allowed or not. So that means you just do it. That means Larry Page, when he invented a search engine, did not ask anybody. Mark Zuckerberg, if he invented a social network, so there was no need to ask for permission. He just did it. So, and this is really a different thing, which makes the Internet so different from other communication services. And another thing is that with the Internet, you are using resources which are unlimited and are not territorial, have no territorial linkage. It means all resources we know from the industrial age, coal, oil, minerals, or whatever, are limited resources and are linked to a certain territory. Oil is in the Middle East. Certain minerals are in Siberia. Coal is in the Ukraine. So that means you have a certain territory. And so this has produced a lot of wars and troubles because people want to have access to resources or want to control resources. So because if you have a limited resource, then, it gets, you start a battle. Who gets the resource? But with IP addresses and domain names, the main resources of the Internet, you have not such a problem, because these are theoretically, not in a mathematical sense. In a mathematical sense, there are also limited resources. But, in a theoretical sense, it's nearly unlimited resources. If you need new domain names, you just create new domains, as ICANN is just doing, with introducing more than 1,000 new generic top-level domains, with endless opportunities to create then domain names for individual use. And with the IP version 6 protocol, so we have also nearly endless IP addresses. And it makes no difference if you register a domain name in Africa or in Asia or in Europe, or if you get an IP address, from a provider outside of your country. It's just the address and the name, and then you can communicate. And this makes it rather different. And although, it creates extreme problems for traditional lawmaking in national parliament. So that means all this, I wanted to show you before we go to the next step. I think a key issue certainly is, before you come to principles, you have to understand how the DNS is working. So there is no time to go into the details of the DNS, but the only thing you have to understand is that the domain name system is based on numbers which are behind the domain name, and each computer has a number, each network has a number, and then the number is translated into a name. When John Postel invented the domain name system, he used the argument and they give the number a human face, because people cannot remember such long numbers. So it's much more easier to remember a nice domain name like flowers.com or iloveyou.de or whatever. So this has a human face. So, and names and numbers are really important to understand all this, including then the root server, which are and the whole server system, and the Internet protocols, which constitute what we call the critical Internet resources. So this is a different system than we know from traditional systems in the industrial age. And certainly, this has raised also the question of the management, how these resources are managed. But before I come to the management, let me go to some of the let's say, conceptual ideas behind all this. And I have a number of quotations here, so I will not go through all of them, but I think it's worth to remember what Tim Berners-Lee had said already in 1991 when he invented the World Wide Web. And he said, there is the idea that society can run without a hierarchical bureaucratic government being involved in every step, if only we can hit on the right set of rules for peer-peer interaction. Our design of the internet and the web is a search for a set of rules which will allow computers to work together in harmony. And our spiritual and social quest is for a set of rules which allow people to work together in harmony. So I think this is a little bit the idea that we, have, let's say, a technical system in place which would allow also people work together in harmony. So I think, and the peer-to-peer interaction, not to have a bureaucratic government, with a hierarchical system, I think is an important element. So this was a driving force behind a lot of these ideas which were produced by the fathers of the internet. And Dave Clark, at this time the president of the IETF, made it very clear when he said, we do not believe in kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus, factual approach, and running code. And this is still today the leitmotif of the IETF. Certainly, John Peter Barlow's Declaration of Cyber Independence, very famous, has put this to the certain extreme, but when he said, okay, governments of the industrial world, you very guide the flesh and steel, and I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. So I think this is not true anymore. I think we have understood that governments have to play a role, but still an open question, what the role of governments is in internet governance. So I think I will come to this a little bit later. So, and here is another quote from Lawrence Lessing, when he, more or less explained to us that code in the internet is something like law in the society, because code regulates certainly. But it means, and code, what he's saying, is done by man. So it means the way how we draft the code, so how we, define a protocol, allows people to do things or stops people to do things. I think this is important, in particular his conclusion when he said code is never found, it is only ever made, and only ever made by us, by man. So it means to understand the role of code and the difference between code makers and lawmakers and the relationship between what is code and what is law. I think it's important to understand, how the internet is organized and how it works. And here comes a final quotation from Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, when he was asked by Computer World, I think 2 years ago, when he visited Australia, and the question was, Mr. Cerf, did you expect in 1974, when you invented the TCP/IP protocol, that 30 years later there will be 3 billion people on the net? And so his answer was, like always, certainly, I could not imagine this. And then he added, the question was, would it be something that could be rolled out to the rest of the world? We didn't know for sure, but when we worked on it, we decided not to patent, not to copyright, not to control, but to share everything we knew about the internet design to the general public all around the world. I think here, in this first part of the quotation, you have some key words in it. It said we decided not to patent, not to copyright, not to control, but to share. So this is one of the basic philosophical elements of the internet. It's about sharing, not controlling. So not copywriting, not patent. So I had Vint Cerf on the podium on the 20th anniversary of ISOC in Geneva in April, and I confronted him with this quotation and said, Vint, would you do it again if we were today? And what would be different if you would have copyrighted the TCP/IP protocol? And his answer was, probably I would be a rich man, but we would have not the internet. I think this is really important to understand this basic philosophy of the internet. It's about sharing. And the other point is also very interesting, the second part of the quotation, when he has answered the Computer World. What is amazing is that it was at the US Department of Defense project, and we were in the middle of Cold War. In spite of all that, we made all this completely available to everybody. And the only reason it was possible is nobody paid any attention to us. I think this is a big lesson. That means as soon as you are in the spotlight of governmental policy making, then probably certain developments are blocked because they become pulled into an ideological conflict or power conflict or whatever. So I think the big lesson here is, so all this was done in the shadow of governmental regulation. And as he said, nobody paid any attention to us. Unfortunately, this has changed now. So I think the internet is now on the agenda of the political leaders in the various countries, of governments, and also big business leaders. So that means the internet is not anymore the same as it was 20 or 40 years ago. But anyhow, we should remember the basic philosophies, and we should try, to keep what is worth to keep. So let's go further down then to the 1990s, when there was a growing need, to develop some frameworks and principles for internet governance. And so I go not through all the details, but in the 90s there was a battle, who should manage these critical internet resources. There were various ideas, whether it should be done by JANA, the organization which was created by John Postel based on a contract with the US Department of Commerce, or by ISOC, the Internet Society, which was established in 1992, or whether it should be done by the ITU, which became engaged in 1997. Or finally, the US government stepped in and said the best thing is we do it as a private but global organization. So that means no government should have control over these resources. This should be managed by the providers and the users of the services themselves. So, and this has led to the creation of ICANN. ICANN has a mandate to manage the root server, domain names, IP addresses, and protocols, and it's based on a so-called multi-stakeholder mechanism where various constituencies, private sector, civil society, the technical community, users, and also governments in advisory capacity, participate. And insofar, ICANN can be seen as an innovation from this internet process if it comes to political institutions, because this is a new type of mechanism which you cannot compare with the traditional intergovernmental organization, which is based on sovereign nation states. So ICANN is a union of constituencies from various stakeholder groups, from civil society, private sector, technical community, and governments play certainly a certain role in it. So the next step then, after the year 2000, was the World Summit on the Information Society. I think until the 1990s, the internet was known and used mainly in the northern Western world, plus Australia and New Zealand. So, but Africa, China, South America, had only, limited access to the internet until the end of the 1990s. But this changed with the year 2000. And insofar, it was very natural that the so-called rest of the world, said, okay, something is going on and we have to do something about it. The discussion started with the discovery of a global digital divide. So the idea was, okay, we have to bridge this digital divide. We have to give everybody, every people on the globe, access to the internet so that he can enjoy also the benefits of the information society. So, but with this digital divide as a main target for the World Summit on the Information Society, we soon entered into a conflict about who oversees the critical internet resources as domain names, IP addresses, and root servers. What will be the role of governments? And what you saw already in the World Summit was that on the one hand, you had already a working mechanism of all these internet organizations, including ICANN, ISOC, the regional internet registries, and the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is responsible for the protocols, the World Wide Web Consortium, and a number of these non-governmental organizations, which did their work, but was very good, without governmental involvement. And now the governments came and said, okay, we want to take over the control. And this has led to a certain conflict, first between China and the United States government, and between ITU and ICANN. And the question was, what to do with this conflict, so how we can settle it. The compromise in the Geneva World Summit on the Information Society in 2003, nearly 10 years ago, was, okay, we cannot settle it here, we have to have a working group. And Kofi Annan, at this time the Secretary General of the United Nations, then was asked to establish such a WGIG, a working group on internet governance. And the interesting thing on the WGIG was the composition, because normally a working group in the United Nations system is done by member states only. But in this case, so the WGIG was composed by a representative from all stakeholder groups. So that means private sector members, civil society, academics, technical community, and governmental representatives. Together, negotiated for nearly 2 years and produced, let's say, I would not say a solution, but an interesting compromise, which is represented in the final report of the WGIG, which was more or less confirmed by the summit, the second summit then in Tunis in 2005. And the key recommendation which came out from the WGIG is that this conflict, whether the internet should have governmental leadership or should have private sector leadership, was settled in a rather, very clever way with the answer by saying the internet does not need a leader. There is no need for leadership. There is a need for collaboration of all involved stakeholders. But it means the multi-stakeholder model is the compromise between the conflict, governmental leadership, China ITU on the one hand, and private sector leadership, US States government and ICANN on the other hand. The multi-stakeholder model includes all stakeholders in their respective roles. So this is exactly what the WGIG proposed as the definition for internet governance. The definition says internet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their respective roles. So I think this is really, the basis for future thinking about internet governance, that it should not be reduced to a governmental document or a private sector document or a civil society document. You have to bring the stakeholders together and they have to agree. And so this would, deliver then sustainable results, sustainable development. The second part of the definition is also of great importance, because it speaks of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. So here, as in Vint Cerf's quotation, the catchword is shared. So that means principles, norms, rules have to be shared. So that means if only governments respect principles, this doesn't work. So that will be in contrast to activities of the private sector and civil society, or the technical community can undermine it. That means you have to find ways to elaborate principles, norms, and rules, which are shared by all stakeholders. Otherwise, it won't work. And the same is with decision-making procedures. So that means as traditional top-down decision-making procedure by one decision maker will also not work in the future. So that means you have to innovate, you have to produce some new creative decision-making procedures where you get, before you make a final decision, all voices on board. And here you need a bottom-up, transparent, open policy development process, which is rather different from traditional law and policy making as we know it from parliaments from the 20th century. Insofar, the WGIG really, opened the door for a very innovative, creative new policy model, the multi-stakeholder model, which is still under discussion, which is not yet fully elaborated. But, this is a step into a new territory. But if you take into consideration the experiences of the last 50 years, that's the only way how you can manage this new beast, what we call the internet. We have ongoing conflicts, in particular about the oversight over the critical internet resources. The WGIG produced several models. There's no time to go here into the details for the models. And so it offered a space for discussion, what should be done. And this is now the Internet Governance Forum, and the 7th edition of the Internet Governance Forum will be held in Baku next week. So insofar, the Tunis summit was at a certain importance, because it confirmed the WGIG definition. It adopted a number of general principles, including multi-stakeholderism. It respected also the sovereignty of countries over their namespace, the country code top-level domains. It decided to establish the Internet Governance Forum, and it started a process of enhanced cooperation, which is a catchword for oversight over the critical Internet resources, but there was no way to find a solution for this in Tunis 2005, and so this remains on the agenda for the next couple of years, whether we could find something for the oversight mechanism. But meanwhile, a lot of things have changed also. And since the end of the Tunis summit 7 years ago, a lot of things have changed. Certainly a fundamental change has taken place in the relationship between US government and ICANN. So that means while ICANN was seen, in particular by China, Russia, and some other countries in 2005 still as a puppet of the US government, ICANN is now more or less independent, has made even decisions which were criticized by the US government. If I go back to the XXX decision or the introduction of new generic top-level domains. So it means the arrangement now between the US government and the ICANN is the so-called affirmation of commitment, which gave on the one hand ICANN a certain an independence from the US government, and and ICANN is now accountable to a so-called decentralized multi-stakeholder review mechanism, where the US government plays a certain role, in particular if it comes to accountability and transparency, where they have a permanent seat in the review mechanism. But the review, the oversight over ICANN is done now by this review mechanism. This is not so well known and it's not so visible, but I think this review mechanism of ICANN is really important because also it introduces a new type of oversight, not a centralized oversight mechanism done by governments, but a decentralized oversight mechanism which involves all stakeholders. That means in the various review teams, you have members from all stakeholders, not only governments, but also private sector, civil society, and the technical community. So we are in the early stage of this review mechanism. The second round will start next year. So let's wait and see how this will work. But the ICANN of 2012 and 2013, now with a new CEO, is rather different from ICANN from 2005 or 2008. And it remains to be seen how this will be further developed. So the IGF has also changed rather substantially. We had 6 IGFs so far. The 7th one will be in Baku. In the meantime, there was an evaluation by the United Nations Commissions for Science and Technology Development. There was a special IGF improvement working group which made some recommendations what can be improved. So there are a number of issues. It starts with output from the IGF and goes to the finances, how to make it sustainable so that they have a secure budget. So far, the mandate of the IGF was enhanced until 2015, and I think the Baku meeting will be rather important because we have still 2 different approaches. One, people say, okay, now just to have an annual meeting, with like an academic meeting with a lot of workshops is not enough. It's no concrete outcome. So we have to have something on paper or certain decisions which come out from this meeting. Others say, okay, no, the IGF as it stands, it's good. Does not need so much improvement. It needs a little bit more better professionalism and probably a little bit more money. So, but it's still enough to have an annual meeting. So it remains to be seen, how this will be further evolved. So if the Baku IGF becomes a success, then certainly, this will help to move forward. If it is a failure, then, critical people will come and say, okay, let's change the status of the IGF, at least after 2015. So for me, this is still an open question, and it depends really from the reality, the success of the IGF in Baku. But the other thing with the IGF is, and this is probably also of great importance, that it has triggered endless numbers of regional and national IGFs around the globe. So we have a list now of nearly 50 or more national and regional IGFs where people have discovered that the best way in their country, in their nation state or in their region to stimulate a multi-stakeholder dialogue which brings the various stakeholders out of their silos and pulls them into a dialogue to understand the complex issues of the internet much better, So let's wait and see how this will continue. In the United Nations, we have meanwhile also a number of debates about the Internet, mainly in the General Assembly. We have several reports from the Secretary General. We have a number of proposals by member states. No time here to go into the details. And then you have the ITU, which has, not forgotten about the Internet. In contrary, so there are a number of ITU member states who still believe that the ITU is a better place to come to decisions. And the similar discussions you have in other organizations like the WTO and WIPO, and the ACTA. The ACTA treaty was a good example that if governments alone act, what they will achieve nearly nothing, because if people, the ordinary people, the end users, have the feeling that governments make decisions which are contrary to their interests, then they will protest against it. And the ACTA protest was a good proposal. So what is the situation today? If I try to summarize this, then we say that meanwhile, even the G8 have discussed the Internet. Last year's summit meeting in Deauville has produced an interesting document where the governments of the 8 largest democracies, more or less industrial nations, agreed on 6 basic principles. And one of the interesting elements here is that the multi-stakeholder governance model is among the 6 principles which was agreed by the presidents, including Mr. Obama and Mr. Medvedev from Russia and Mrs. Merkel from Germany, and this time still Mr. Sarkozy from France. In the United Nations, we have meanwhile 3 committees dealing with Internet issues. So it's the first committee, which deals with security questions. Here you have a Russian-Chinese proposal for a code of conduct and a cybersecurity convention. In the second committee, which deals with social economic developments, you had a proposal from India, South Africa, and Brazil to establish a council for Internet-related policies, still under discussion. In the third committee, which deals human rights, we have now a resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council, which says that human rights offline are as important as human rights online, so that the same rights should be guaranteed also in the online world. And the special rapporteur, Frank LaRue from Guatemala, has produced a very interesting report, and I recommend everybody to read it. So we have in 2012 also some other challenges ahead of us. There will be the WGIG conference in Dubai in December 2012, where the telecommunication regulation treaty from 1988, long before the World Wide Web was invented, has to be renewed. And there are some efforts to extend the telecommunication regulation to the Internet, which creates some problems because, as I described in the beginning of the lecture, the Internet is rather different organized from the telecom. Telecom is a hierarchical network, where you have a country code, a city code, and all the numbering is totally different from the systems on the Internet. And if you extend telecommunication regulation to the Internet, then we undermine, let's say, the nature and basic regulations of the Internet as has been evolved in the last 30, 40 years. And then you have a number of other processes. No time to go here into the details. The OECD is dealing with this. They have adopted a declaration. There's a new process started by the British Foreign Minister William Hague last year, the called London process. Recently, there was a conference in Budapest where they also discussed a number of principles. The Council of Europe has adopted a declaration of principles, and a lot of other organizations have also adopted principles. So that means I come now to the end of the lecture. So if you discuss all these principles, then I have tried to structure these principles into 4 baskets. So I think the key basket, from a user perspective at least, is that the Internet governance is a human rights issue, because it's about people, and people have individual rights: the right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, privacy. These are the 3 most important human rights, but there are also other rights. If you go through the Human Rights Convention from 1966, which defines political and civil rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, then you could say, based on the resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council in February this year, that all human rights which are guaranteed offline has to be guaranteed also online. And insofar, all internet governance principles have to start with the human rights dimension. Then the second basket is the policy model. So that means I would be very afraid if we would put the internet under traditional governance models. That means an intergovernmental treaty system where, let's say, heads of states and governments negotiate only and exclude the other stakeholders. So this is the ACTA model, which, as I have said already, this fails. So that means we have to have a new policy model for global arrangements for the internet, and this can be only the multi-stakeholder model. It means decision-making, policy development, and decision-making procedure, which includes all stakeholders. Very important is that you keep the architecture of the internet as it is. That's the end-to-end principles with open standards based on security and stability. So, and there's a risk from two sides to undermine this. On the one hand, a big business also, do not like it and want to look for new opportunities, to pull people in their networks, in their clouds or whatever, in their bubbles. I think Facebook, Apple are good examples where you have just to sign in, and then you are more or less part of this bubble, and you give away some of your rights and freedoms you have as an individual internet users, because then you delegate or give away these freedoms to this corporation. So that means the freedom of the internet is challenged both by commercial interests and of big corporations and by political interests of some governments. So that means it's a sandwich situation, and only with an enabled and strong end user we can preserve the openness and freedom of the internet. And finally, there are a number and a growing number of public policy issues which has to be settled this way, but always, as I said, in a multi-stakeholder mode. That means that all stakeholders participate in policy development. It goes from access to network, access to knowledge, data protection, intellectual property protection, fair competition, cultural and linguistic diversity, fighting cybercrime, and even the issue of cyber war probably, will become an important issue in the years ahead. So this brings me now nearly to the final two slides. So I think what are the open questions? It means, what means multi-stakeholderism? As I said, the concept was discussed already in the 90s, but more or less accepted then in the 2005 Tunis summit, but we still have not yet a very clear definition and a clear understanding what multi-stakeholderism means. So these are questions who has the final authority in decision-making and who oversees all the processes? We have some elements like, in particular in the GAG is insofar, the ICANN is pioneering how this could be worked. So that means who has the oversight? Is it a review mechanism? What role of the GAG, the Government Advisory Committee? So the same thing is, now with the improvement of the Internet Governance Forum. Will the decision be made by governments only in the United Nations General Assembly? What will be the role of the other stakeholders if it comes to a certain decision? So that means the respective role of stakeholders, as it said in the definition, has not cleared, what exactly the respective role is. So this is open for discussion. Here we need more clarification. And that's also the question, what are the appropriate bodies for political discussions and decision-making? Is it ICANN? ICANN has only a limited role for the technical management of the technical resources. Is it the IGF? The IGF has no decision-making capacity, fortunately. Is it the United Nations? These are only governments. G7, G20, these are only governments. So should we invent a new political body? I think the proposal by the IPSA countries, Brazil, South Africa, and India, for a Council for Internet-related policies, could be an interesting starting point, but it will fail if it would be designed only as a new intergovernmental body. What we need indeed is a multi-stakeholder body based on a document, a framework of principles which are, which is endorsed by all stakeholders, not only by governments, but also by ICANN, by IETF, by Google, by Facebook, by Microsoft and by the civil society organizations, Transparency International, Consumer International, APC, and others. That means we have to have such a broad framework, which would then allow that all partners, agree on these basic principles. And so far, we shall have to look beyond traditional naming of declaration resolution or things like that. So we have already a new language here in this field if it comes to legal instruments. We have AOC, affirmation of commitment, LOI, letter of intent, MOU, memorandum of understanding, and I propose here a framework of commitment, or a framework of commitment for principles or something like that. But it means here we have to be really innovative and we have to do something which is new. So, and this brings me to the very final slide. If you look ahead in the year 2020, what will we have? Probably more than 5 billion users. We will have a multilingual internet. We have all kinds of converged services. We have a multi-stakeholder governance model, probably the Internet of Things. Probably we go beyond the DNS. God knows, what will be. So, but the problems will still be whether the network will be unified as one global, open, free, and borderless Internet, or we will see a fragmentation of the Internet, and new borders are erected where the Internet is closed, censored. The other question is how the policy will be developed. Will it be a top-down policy by governments only, or a bottom-up policy where all stakeholders are involved? So the management, will it be the multi-stakeholder self-organization, or will we move towards governmental or commercial control? All this is open. But whatever happens, one thing is for sure. Internet governance will remain the subject of high-level political controversy, and it will be about power and money. So this is the final conclusion. So the final conclusion could have been done also 2,000 years ago in the old Rome Empire, or 1,000 years ago in the Middle Ages, because it was always about power and money. But this time it's different because it's not the classical power and money questions anymore. It's much bigger because we have now enabled billions of enabled end users, and insofar we have reached a new quality, and we have to figure out how we can manage these challenges of power and money in the 21st century. So thank you for the lecture. I have to be sorry that I was a little bit longer than expected, but it's a big subject for Tuesday morning. So I had no chance when I was talking to read all your questions. I see in my chat room here that there are a number of questions, and I don't know. So I have no audio, so that means I cannot hear you, and I'm waiting for some instruction from Arvid, what to do now.
Thank you, Professor, for this. The question, please ask your questions to Professor Wolfgang Kleinwächter into the chat. Type it into the chat, and Professor will try to answer some of that.
Yeah, how to continue now? Will I get questions, or I just had your voice, Arvin, so I'm waiting now. Probably you can put in the chat some questions. So I thought, one point where I said, okay, what is the measurement of success for Baku? And he said one measure, it's Maureen Hilliard. She says, one measure is participation, a wide range of stakeholders, but I know that Pacific participation will be low. It was going to take me 48 hours to get there, so I had to turn down an offer to attend. And so that means what we probably have to use much more is this form of communication we have here with this webinar, remote participation. I think if I compare the technology for remote participation, then we have seen an incredible, I could say, revolution in the last 15 years. So I think 15 years ago when ICANN was established, so this was nearly impossible. So we had a channel, for where you could send questions, but we had no chance to do it video or interactive or things like that. So, and now with WebEx or with Adobe Connect and others, we have a lot of instruments available which really reduce this gap. Whether you are there physically in the room or whether you are outside on the Pacific Island or in South America or down in Cape Town. So I think this is really an opportunity, and I think we have to make more use of it. Fortunately, the IGF offers this opportunity for remote participation. So it's still not so comfortable as it could be, but on the other hand, it's really an incredible progress in the last 5 to 10 years. And so this is one answer to the question, that we should not count the physical participation only if we measure the success of Baku, but we should measure also the number of participants for remote participation. And so if I could imagine that probably already in Baku or then the next one in Indonesia, we could have more remote participants than physical participants. So that we see a shift of the center of the discussion, out of the conference room into the cyberspace. I think this is an option. We are not yet there, but I think this is a possibility to do this. Yeah, Maureen says now, Bali is midway because, probably for the Pacific Island, Bali is a little bit better than Azerbaijan. So, but anyhow, travel always means that you are away from your home place for a couple of days. And if you sit in the plane, then it's not such a big difference if you are 3 hours there, 5 hours, or 8 hours. So I think the basic question is also, to be there, and this costs money, this costs resources, and what to do, so how to get all this. So that means the resource questions for participation is indeed an issue which comes back again and again and again. And hopefully, we can find ways that if we discover new resources which can be exploited, like new top-level domains, we can create, we can use this money in a creative way to enable more people to participate. It means to strengthen the system as it is. So I think ICANN does a lot in this respect. ICANN has enabled, meanwhile, the participation of, I would say, nearly hundreds of people from underprivileged regions. This was not the case 10 years ago. I remember in 2002, 3, 4, when we were fighting and boxing, for just, that ICANN pays for hotel rooms at large of members of the large advisory committee. So that all this was self-paid at this time. People had to pay their own travel, even if they had elected position within ICANN, for instance, in the large advisory committee when it was established. And only over the years, ICANN understood that they will lose this battle about the better governance model if they do not enable their strong stakeholder group of internet users and their large members. And I think this is a clear message, so that if the internet economy produces net profit, and this is also a message to Facebook, to Google, to Apple and others, then this money should be invested into people. So certainly they need investment also into new services and new applications, but the investment in people to enable them to participate not only in using their services and applications, but to participate also in policy development and decision making is of great importance. And I always argued, Facebook now has 1 billion users. Which rights have the users within the Facebook bubble to participate in policies which are developed by the leadership of Facebook? Should there be a Facebook parliament? Should the 1 billion users of Facebook would elect their representatives, which then would negotiate with the Facebook leadership about certain terms and conditions? I think in traditional, at least European and German private corporations like Volkswagen, we have legal guaranteed representation of trade unions. So that means trade unions participate in decision making of the company. And I could imagine that, you know, if we are moving further down the road to such big bubbles as Facebook or Apple is, that we could consider such an option. And I think the IGF is a good place just to raise some issues and to see what direction would be to pull Facebook and others into such a debate. So I try to read the next questions here. And that is a debate about you know, how hopeful we can be with the multi-stakeholder model, internet independence, independent from governance. So the independence from governance, as I said a little bit earlier when I had quotations from John Peter Barlow, I would say yes and no, but it means each stakeholder has to bring its own house in order. And each stakeholder cannot be substituted by another stakeholder. But all are interdependent in a certain way. So they have to work together. So they have to be independent, but the independence does not mean they are superior or, you know, has to be, you know, can substitute the other stakeholders. The multi-stakeholder governance model is based on an interdependence on equal footing in their respective roles of all stakeholders. I think equal footing in respective roles is an important, these are two important elements, because they are equal. That means governments are not above the other stakeholders, they are not below. They are partners, and they have to respect each other, but they play a different role. So it's not the civil society who would say, you know, governments go home and now we make the law. So it means the lawmaker, the lawmaking capacity remains in the hands of a democratically elected parliament. I think this is for sure. But on the other hand, that's not enough. A lot of lawmakers do not understand the issue, so they need probably more than technical advice. They have to trust also that certain technical decisions are better made by technical community than by the parliament. And to listen to the civil society is also an important element. It's not enough just to say, okay, send us a letter, and then we will take this into account. So it means the parliamentary debate has to be also renovated. And, you know, with all the concepts we have now in various countries, liquid democracy or participatory democracy or fluid democracy or deliberative democracy, we see that here, you know, the understanding of democracy is changing. We are moving from a classical representative democracy of the 20th century into something new of the 21st century, which is not yet defined. So we are on the road. We are still in the rain. So I think this is probably a challenge for the future. So I get a phone call. Wait a moment. Hello. Yeah. 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 Okay. Yes. Yes, this is a good question. When China doesn't let people use Facebook. Okay. The role of China, the role of Russia, the role of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Pakistan, a lot of other countries. This is a big challenge. So to be frank, I cannot answer the questions in a way either or. What I see is this remains a permanent cat and mouse game. With, you know, if you go to the Great Firewall in China, you have hundreds of ways to bypass, to tunnel it, to circumvent it. On the other hand, you have governmental institutions which are firing back, which are jailing bloggers and, you know, try to suppress this. This is part of the ongoing battle, and I'm afraid that we will have to continue this battle. And what it means to be united, to have strong arguments on your side, to be technical ahead of the other groups, I think this is a permanent challenge. We will never have a situation where I said, okay, now it's clear. Now we have what we want to have. So freedom is an issue which where you have to work on it on a daily basis. And so there are a lot of quote unquote enemies around you. But you have to settle these issues on a peaceful way and in a deliberative way. That's why deliberative democracy is important. Dialogue, bottom-up policy development process is important. Certainly, you need two for a tango. If one party rejects to have dialogue, then it gets difficult. But you have no alternative. The only way is moving forward, or as Bill Clinton has said, stumbling forward. So it's a complicated process, and in particular for the young generation, I think this is a big challenge for the rest of your life, because this will remain a big problem for the whole 21st century. So still 87 years to go in the 21st century. We are on the very, very early stage, and be prepared for a lot of other struggles and conflicts.
Thank you, Professor. Any other questions? If not, we should end this.
Okay, then. Thank you for listening to me. I apologize again for being too long, but it's a big subject, and so I hope you can make use of some of my arguments, and then let's see next time in cyberspace.
Thank you, Professor. Always nice to see you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending our IG webinar, and let's hope we see each other online.